Hi there. This is a poem about travelling. Well, about coming home from travels. Coming back home after years of travel and the welcome you might expect. It's called Traveller's Tales by Alexander Robertson. The return trip was his last trip and probably the riskiest of all. Having survived world dangers with the help of strangers, he was going home to confront the hostility of friends. He had been warned by an old-time tripster, no matter where in the world you might roam, never to expect the stories you collect will be of interest to anyone back home. The locals had an idea of his travels, enough without them or him having to say. He'd be content to savour the unspoken respect and be quietly modest in their company. He was going home as a listener, ready to fit in and hear all. Tell me again about the streetlights blackout, and what was that about the neighbour's wall? He was given a great welcome, bought pints as one of their own, the talk congenial and never-ending, the nights loud and long. He had revived them, the locals, eager to join in. Not for the tales he was telling them, but the stories they were telling him, as the only one who hadn't heard them in the last 30 years. After a month of it, he was up to date. Then the talk became nothing much and much the same the next day, leaving the space in conversation for what he might have to say, if they hadn't preferred the silence to him telling them where he'd been while away. He knew it, he expected it, he'd been warned, but not on the effect of it, which diminished him, reduced him to being the lesser for having gone away. His recent years, the missing years, because they weren't theirs. But he knew he was better than that. He was an import of everywhere he'd been. Coming in was the swell of the Indian Ocean, reflecting the heat of an African sun. It was already there in the conversation, a tamarind seed on the Great Divide. When they said boozer, he said bar. When they went down the chippy, he spoke platters of freedom air. It was unsettling for the locals to have one of their own they no longer knew come as a stranger and talk of elsewhere, placing the world between them and what was before, that which it was time to restore. So they did what they always did with strangers. They made him a character and gave him a name. Mr. Universe, they called him, which he never got to hear, because they gathered around the joke only when he wasn't there. They had made him an island, safe to visit but not to stay, someone to be quiet in his company until he was wished away, which he eventually was of his own deciding. He had no place in a town which spurned his choice to come home and remain where he'd been, and in going he knew he would never return. Except on the night of his leaving, they were united at last, best pals forever as they waved him off, promised to write and hoping he might be back soon to the welcome he left. He had found by leaving why he had returned, which he took with him as he went. That fond farewell stuck with him as a marker that would grow by the distance he kept. And as the memory grew weaker of how he'd been treated, given time, he might just possibly want to come back. Thank you.